Hi, and welcome to this video tutorial on negotiation planning and strategy. Part 1. My name is Ron Vellon, and welcome to this discussion of the planning process for negotiation from a very high level. You're going to see in other content, other video tutorials, we get into the real nuts and bolts of how to create a plan. This looks at the big picture and the main things you need to do in order to prepare properly and be more confident, more at ease, and more powerful as a negotiator. So let's begin. We start, first of all, by looking at goals. Now, we've all heard the word goals before, and this is just as an important discussion as in any other context. When we talk about goals, we're talking about the overarching main things you want to get out of a negotiation. This is before you even start a plan. Keep in mind that by having really strong, clear goals, that will have a big impact on your plan and eventually the execution of your approach when you get into the negotiation. So if this is in real life or it's a simulation, same idea. And we may already be doing this anyway. Most people do. They think about, what do I want to get out of this negotiation? Sometimes we get lost in the details too soon, but it is important to take a little time and see, what do I really want here? Again, this is not something that would go necessarily into a plan, but will set up your planning process. And keep in mind that our goals can be tangible, intangible, or procedural. So what does that mean? Tangible goals are things like getting the best possible price out of it, getting the best delivery, the best quality, some level of benefit or benefits that you can put your hands on. It's part of the experience. Intangible ones are often things that may be in support of your experience. Maybe one of your intangible goals is to create a nice working relationship with the person you're negotiating with. Maybe it's to create a working environment that's more amenable, more friendly if you're trying to negotiate something with a union. And the list goes on and on. But these are the things that are not as concrete as things like price or quantity or delivery dates and things like that. And then we have procedural. Procedural goals have a lot to do with how the negotiation takes place. Where is it happening? What time of day? What media are you using? Is it in person? Is it via Zoom? Is it by phone? Where are you going to actually meet? In other words, are you going to meet in an office? Are you going to meet in a restaurant? Are you going to meet somewhere else? All of these things are kind of procedural. It has a lot to do with, what do I really want to make sure happens here? Maybe you want to have some really clear conditions about behavior. So maybe you've worked with this person before and you know they tend to get really emotional, and you want to make sure there's a mechanism in place that handles it. So you might put in some kind of request that we approach this in a friendly manner, or you may have some other requirement that we have lots of ice water, or that we can bring team members to the negotiation, and so on. So those are the procedural goals. What are some of the direct effects of goals? First of all, we need to understand that wants are not goals. It's really important that you nail down what your actual goals or desired outcomes are. These, in part, will get translated into targets, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But make sure you're clear about what the goals are. Goals are often linked to other parties' goals. In other words, when you're negotiating, and this is true for every negotiation, you're working with someone else to get to a place that you couldn't get to on your own. In other words, you need something from them, and as a result, likely they need something from you. And so if you can understand what their goals are, that will help you help them, and in return, they are more likely to help you. If it's a simple transaction like you're selling a bike or a tennis racket or an old bed or something, maybe you don't care too much about what the other party's goals are. But if you always have that awareness and try to think about what could be the other party's desired outcomes, even if you don't talk about them, that will make you a smarter negotiator. They must be attainable. In other words, what you're doing, what you're negotiating for, must provide you with the opportunity to get what you want out of it. In other words, to attain that goal. It's not that you need to restrict your goal necessarily. It's about being really clear that you can actually fulfill this goal during this negotiation. And remember that effective goals need to be concrete, specific, and measurable. And lastly, we're going to talk about indirect effects, and there could be others, but the biggest one has to do with the relationship. Now, depending on your experience, be it cultural, familial, geographic, how you view the relationship aspect in the negotiation will vary. So the first place to start with this is asking simply, how valuable is this relationship to me? If you're buying or selling a simple object, maybe the relationship doesn't matter as much. If it's an ongoing working relationship, likely that relationship matters a lot, and we need to keep that in mind. It doesn't mean you have to give things up because the relationship is so important that what you're negotiating is less important. As negotiators, we need to integrate our perspective on the value of that relationship into what we're doing. Not that it supersedes or becomes dominant over what we're doing or what we're negotiating, but that we understand how to protect the relationship if it's one of value. Now, you may find your opponent doesn't value it the same way. That's okay. You don't need to be a pushover to save the relationship. And there's all kinds of tools and techniques you can practice to manage that if the person doesn't see that the relationship is that important. Now, let's take a closer look at the planning process itself. The first thing we need to do in a negotiation plan as we start to work on our plan is define the issues. Now, what are issues? This is really important to keep clear. The issues are those elements that you're actually negotiating, that are being negotiated. Often we think, because we're given bad advice, that the issues when it comes to a negotiation are issues the way we might talk about them if we were just speaking normally. Well, it might include context and all of these other things. That is not true. For a negotiation, you need to be really clear about what am I actually negotiating. And why this is important is because in a simple negotiation, you're going to know. If it's buying or selling a product, it's going to be price, maybe delivery, maybe there's some parts involved or whatever. It's not complicated. And for both parties, the negotiated issues are the same. If you get into very complex negotiations, maybe you're trying to negotiate peace in a war-torn country, or there's civil unrest, or there's political infighting. That kind of negotiation involves many issues. And you may have an issue that you want to negotiate, but the other party doesn't agree and doesn't want to negotiate that thing, or maybe they don't see the value of negotiating it. Either way, you need to be clear about what are the negotiated issues here. What are we trying to actually resolve? It could be anything like price, quantity, quality, if there are quality fluctuations that you need to control, dates of delivery, service that follows up a product or service that you have purchased or are purchasing. If you're dealing with a product that is being manufactured, maybe you need to deal with returns. How do you work that out? And there are more that can go on this list. And that's for something that might be in a scenario where you're doing business to business sales and you're trying to work out an agreement with a potential client. These are all issues. What is not an issue? Understanding the economic landscape of the business you're in, getting the political context, understanding that there was a strike before and you're trying to work that through. These are not issues. This is background information that may be important, but it doesn't belong in the plan. It helps you figure out what to put in the plan, but do not include background or context information. Follow the guideline you're getting from the book, from the course and everything else, and focus on defining the issues. If it's price, is it price per unit? Is it price per box? Is it price per 12 dozen? Once you define the issues, you assemble them together in what we call a bargaining mix. And you want to put them together in the list of priority. In other words, you want to put the most important on top and the least important on the bottom. So when you have it in your plan, and in our case, it's the first thing you put into a plan, it's right at the top of the first page, you want to make sure you can easily see and refer back to what's important, especially if you get into a very complex simulation or a complex life circumstance where you really need to know, okay, got to get the best possible delivery schedule, or got to get the best possible price, or need to know how to handle things like returns, whatever is the most important thing, make sure you put that at the top, and it'll be easier for you to refer back to it and understand what your priorities are. Are the issues linked or separate? In my opinion, they're always linked in some way, but in reality, some things are really, really connected. So let's say you're negotiating salary and it's for a new job and you're being offered a job. Well, salary is one thing, but what if you're in sales, or what if you're a department head and there's a big bonus opportunity there? Maybe if you take less bonus, there's potential for a bigger upside in terms of a large bonus that would be much bigger than your original salary and smaller bonus. So that's something where those two things are very directly linked. Or maybe salary is one thing and they're only going to give you 4 weeks vacation, but really want 8 weeks vacation. And they might be willing to give it to you if they pay you less. So those two things are very tightly linked. Whether or not you have a corner office, or you can just casually to work every day, or can work from home half the time, may not be directly linked to your salary. But underneath, of course, they're linked because it's part of the same job. So it's up to you to determine how these things are linked, so that when you're negotiating, you can talk about it intelligently and listen carefully for how the other person sees the link between the two, because they will often play those things off each other during a negotiation, just like I was saying. So if you want more time off, the person may be willing to do it, but they may have to reduce the salary in order to deal with what they perceive as your lost time, your extra time away, that extra 2 weeks or 4 weeks away. Next are interests. Why you want what you want. Let's go back to the example that we were discussing. You're negotiating for salary and other things for a new job, let's say. And you're thinking about salary, you're thinking about vacation time and office space and how you dress, your parking spot, even if there's a gym membership or other perks, whatever it is, training opportunities. If you ask for more time off, let's say the company is offering you 4 weeks vacation, that's their standard vacation, and there may not be a lot of flexibility, but what if you explain to them that you need 8 weeks because you like to get extra training in a certain area to keep your skills up? Even though maybe a lot of people would think that would be part of business time or work time, and you wouldn't need to take vacation for that. In other words, they would pay you anyway. Well, vacation is paid normally anyway. So in this case, you might be thinking, well, why is this important? And what do I need to convey during the negotiation that might show the potential employer that this is to their benefit as well? So understanding your interests may or may not come up. It certainly doesn't come up if you do distributive bargaining, which is basically compromise, but it does come up in integrative negotiation, or win-win, or mutual interest negotiation, as it's often called. So understanding your interests will also help you figure out, is getting whatever I want out of this negotiation going to fulfill my interests? Or maybe it will only fulfill my interests partially, but at least you have an understanding and perspective. So let's look at the types of interests that we encounter. We know that interests may be substantive. What that means, it's directly related to the focal issues under negotiation, or the issues you're actually negotiating. So you want more money. Your interest in that is about maybe reducing debt. Maybe you have a big mortgage on your house, or you have some credit card debt, and the extra money will help you relieve that pressure. Or maybe it's because you want to take an amazing trip and go to a country far away, and it's going to be very expensive. And so whatever it is, these are interests you want to note for yourself so that you are clear about why you're asking for something. It may or may not come up in the conversation, but you want to be really clear. Process-based interests have to do with how the negotiation is actually taking place. In other words, what's my interest in having a relaxed negotiation? What is my interest in seeing that we take breaks regularly? So make sure you understand your process-based interests, or the ones that are related to how the negotiation takes place. And the last one is the relationship-based interest. Now, this is connected, of course, to our relationship perspective going into the negotiation. We talked about relationship goals. What is my interest in this ongoing relationship with my opponent? Now, if this is a scenario that I'm working on or negotiating with a partner, a spouse, or children, your own children, or friends, likely those relationships are very important. You want to maintain and have a great relationship with these people. You don't want to sacrifice completely the negotiation necessarily for the sake of the relationship. But in this case, or in cases like these where the relationship is paramount, really, really important, you don't have to give up everything to save the relationship, because if you approach the negotiation in a way that there will be mutual benefit here, and do it in a way that is considerate of the other person, doesn't mean you have to give in on everything. But if you're considerate, respectful, whatever respectful might mean to you or your opponent in the negotiation, then the relationship will be okay. One of the biggest mistakes people make in their close relationships is not to negotiate or follow through completely on a negotiation about something that's important to them. We may think we're saving or protecting the relationship in the short run, but in the long run, we may develop resentment because we're not getting our needs met in the relationship, and we didn't take the extra time to negotiate something that was of value and may or may not have been of value to the other person, but it doesn't matter if it's important to you. It could be anything related to the relationship or even outside of the relationship. Maybe you want to buy a new car and your partner is concerned about money down the road because maybe they want to take an extra long vacation, or maybe they want to travel. Right now you feel you need the car or want the car, and their needs may be a bit different. So how you negotiate that is to truly take the time to understand each other, and that way you protect the relationship. It might be a little bit uncomfortable, but in the end, if you do it right, the relationship will likely end up being stronger. Next, we look at defining and clarifying limits. The biggest one is our resistance point. This is the point, and this is described in Chapter 2 on distributed bargaining and elsewhere, that this is the point where we say no. Whether we walk away or not, this is a point that we say, you know what? If we're selling, this is the lowest possible price I'm willing to go. And if we're buying, it's the highest price I'm willing to pay. And there may be other resistance points depending on what you're negotiating. It also needs to be considered in context with your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Your resistance point and your BATNA are not the same thing. The quality of your alternatives will help determine your resistance point, because if you have a great alternative, then maybe you can have a really strong resistance point because you know you've got another option that's equally good. But rarely is the BATNA equal to what you're negotiating, because if it were, maybe you wouldn't even bother negotiating. And so your alternative is what happens when negotiation falls apart, or if you don't negotiate. What else could you do? Next, you have to set your target or targets. Your targets and opening bids, and these are offers and counter offers. These are things that you want to think about after considering your opponent, the circumstance, maybe doing some other research. Understand that your target is the outcome that you realistically expect. Now, your target may be a cluster of things: price, delivery date, blah, blah, maybe a combination of things. But you want to make sure that you don't have a target that's the same as an offer or a counter offer. A target is not equal to an offer. If you do that, you're going to end up with not very much space to actually negotiate, because it's going to be like saying, I want to sell a bicycle for $4,000 and my target is $4,000. Well, the reality is most people negotiate with the idea that an opening offer is the first price. Now, you may be able to get your asking price. That happens sometimes. But more often than not, you're going to need some room. So if you surpass your target and you better than your target, great, celebrate, awesome. But you want to think clearly, what is my main objective here? What do I really want to get in terms of an agreement or a deal? That's your target. Then you set your offer or sale price accordingly. You include your resistance point in this conversation and really figure out those things. I recommend going back to the content on Bargaining Zone, which is in another video tutorial on distributed bargaining. Remember that your asking price is the best possible outcome that you can hope to achieve. It's not likely to happen, but like I said, it does happen. Sometimes we're surprised. You want to also make sure you assess your constituents in the social context of the negotiation, which we're going to talk about in a moment. These are the people that you're accountable to, or the people that might be watching you. Partners, family, friends, bosses, colleagues, co-workers, other people on a team, you name it. And we're going to take a look at that in a moment. Before we do that, I want to just introduce one last idea here, and that's the idea of an anchor. It's not a big concept in the book necessarily, but it is something that you really need to understand when we go into a negotiation. When we see an asking price for something, let's say we're buying something online through Craigslist or Pink Bike or some other resale vehicle, typically it's understood that an asking price is the asking price and there's usually room to negotiate. But sometimes people will say we're firm. What we're asking for, we're sticking with, and they don't want to negotiate. They just want to get what their asking price is. That puts an anchor in people's minds, whatever the asking price is, and so would your counteroffer if that is something that you end up doing. Think of it as two extremes. And it doesn't matter if it's a product or service or other things that are non-monetary or non-quantitative in a negotiation. But let's take a simple example. If you're selling a car and you're asking $19,000 and someone comes along and offers $13,700. Some folks might look at that offer and be insulted or angry that they're offering $13,700. That's fine. Accept it as the opening offer that it is. Don't get all confused or frustrated by somebody's opening offer. Just treat it as an opening offer with less emotionality and you'll be in a stronger position. But what it does is to a vendor or someone selling something, when they get an offer that's lower than or significantly lower, it is a bit of an anchor in our awareness psychologically and says, even for a few seconds, that the range of prices is our frame. In reality, it's the resistance points that determine the bargaining zone. But in our minds, we're now dealing with $13,700 on one end and $19,000 on the other. And mentally, we as humans tend to go for the middle. What does the middle look like? But if we're smart negotiators, we'll say, okay, that's just an opening offer. And you can treat it as something like that and don't get too hung up on the anchor in your own mind, but be aware that the anchor does take place. Just don't let it control you. By the same token, if you are the buyer and hopefully your opponent is not as good a negotiator, you can actually manipulate the negotiation a bit by offering something that creates a new anchor in their mind. It may actually cause them to doubt their initial asking price. This has happened to me. I mean, many years ago, I sold a car when I was living in Toronto. It was a used car, and I thought it was worth, I don't remember at the time, it was a long time ago, maybe $14,000, and somebody offered me $9,500. And I started to doubt whether the car had the value I thought it did, especially when it's one of our own items. When we're selling something that is ours personally, we tend to overvalue it a little bit just because we have a personal connection to it. In the end, I think I ended up selling it for $11,500 or $11,900 or something. I can't remember. But it does create some doubt, especially if 2 or 3 people offer you a low price or much lower than you thought. Then you start to see a trend. And then you have to decide, am I going to be patient or am I going to give in? If you give in right away, the other person probably has a little more power because you're caving in a little bit to that impression. Or if you really need to sell the car quickly because you need the money or something, you might find yourself falling into a bit of a trap. So be careful with that. So that's just an anchor. That's just a concept that is good to keep in mind when you're dealing with opening offers, counter offers, that kind of thing. What kind of anchors are you putting in someone's mind? Okay, we're going to pick up the pace here a little bit. The social context of the negotiation is something you may or may not be completely familiar with, but most of us have a social context in any situation. Well, what does this mean? Well, let's break this down pretty simply and clearly, because this is something we need to think about and do think about, again, consciously or unconsciously, in pretty much every negotiation. First of all, we have the direct actors. That's us. That's our own point of view. We are A. So just keep that in mind. You're the direct actor. You're likely the one that has the most vested interest in what you're doing, unless you're a sales rep for a company working on a big deal. Yes, you have a vested interest because your job is at stake, but the company may also have a really big interest in what's going on, which we'll talk about in a moment. Next, we have the opposition actors. That's B. So you can see the field, the model we use here. It could be a football field, a soccer field, B are basically your opponents, your negotiation opponents. Now it starts to get a little bit more interesting. We get into what we call indirect actors. C, these are the people that are on the sidelines but have a lot of interest in a stake likely in what's going on. If you're a sales rep for a company and I'm your boss, I'm your sales manager, I have a really big interest in how you perform. I'm not involved in your negotiations directly very much, but I do need to keep an eye on how you're doing, how you're performing. And of course, I have a boss, which we'll get to in a moment. But that's something where an indirect actor has a stake in what you're doing, but they're not directly involved. Maybe you go to people to check in to make sure. In the case of a sales manager, you might need an approval for a specific kind of deal. So these are the indirect actors. Maybe they're members of a team that you work with and you're representing your team on a specific situation. Maybe you need more resources from your team's boss. Whatever it is, there may be people that are involved in this, even though you're the one negotiating on your own. If you're a lawyer and you have a client, your client has a big interest in what you're negotiating, whether it's a civil matter or a criminal matter or whatever. So indirect actors, they sit on the sidelines. Maybe you go to them for advice or to check in or get approvals, but you're negotiating without them being in the room for the most part. Now, there are circumstances where the indirect actors may be involved. They may come to a negotiation. You see this happen with big union management negotiations where each side will have a big team of people and some people will be indirect actors, but you or the lead negotiators will be doing all the work. Then we have the interested observers. These are the folks that are way back on the sidelines. And in the case of a sales management role, if I'm your sales manager and you're a sales rep, maybe it's my boss. So it's the vice president of sales who I report to. It's unlikely he or she would get involved in supervising you directly, but if something's not working, they may come to me and say, hey, how come so-and-so doesn't seem to be performing well over the last few months? And I may need to explain, well, they're going through new training or whatever. They will have an interest in how things are going, but they won't necessarily be as connected as the indirect actors. And then finally, we get into environmental factors. Environmental factors are those things that provide context and have implications on our negotiation, but are not stakeholders in it. In other words, they influence us and what we're negotiating. They could be part of our general environment if you think about terminology from marketing or strategy, or the specific environment. You know, the general environment might be the political or economic situation you're going through. Right now, as I'm producing this tutorial, we're still working with COVID and getting people vaccinated and so on. That's certainly a general environment element. If you actually work in healthcare, if you work at a hospital, it's part of your specific environment. So that's what we mean by environmental factors. What's the environment in which you're negotiating? Next thing we look at is understanding the other party. So all the work you did for yourself, you need now to do an educated guess of what all of these things we've been talking about are for them. And you do your research, maybe from experience, and you try to figure out, it's kind of like a chess game. You need to be 2, 3, 4 moves ahead so that you can adapt. And in chess, you think of multiple scenarios depending on which way you move your pieces. In this case, you want to think, you know, what are they trying to get out of this negotiation? And you try to have some empathy around it. You want to make sure that you look at the bargaining mix. So you have to come up with, you know, their target, their resistance point, try to figure out what their alternative is, what their BATNA is. And you go through the whole thing in a way you're creating a mini plan for them that will help you understand their side of it. Now, if it's a very simple transaction, the buying and selling of some used item, you may only want to make a few notes for yourself, or you maybe just think about it. But for our simulations, which are more involved, you need to include this as part of your plan. We need to see that you're thinking about your opponent and trying to figure out what are they thinking, perhaps. And there's no easy answer to this, and you're likely not to get it perfectly right. But it still matters that you're thinking about your opponent and what they might be doing. In my terms, something I borrow from the organization development world is this is part of what we call go slow to go fast. In other words, up front, taking that extra time to understand your opponent among all the other things you've been doing so far allows you to go more effectively and quickly forward because you're really well prepared. And even though you won't guess perfectly what your opponent is going to do in terms of target and alternatives and all that, it still helps you understand and be more prepared. You want to know what their interests and needs are for sure. And again, you won't get it perfectly right, but you can imagine. You want to think about what their reputation and style is. Now, if you don't know them, in real life, you might do a little bit of research and see if you know people that know them and try to find out. If it's something that we do in a simulation, if you know the person, you might know what their negotiation style is. Or if you know them, you might be surprised and think you know what their style would be, but it actually isn't. So if you've negotiated with someone before, great, you know what their style and reputation might be. Who are their constituents? Who are they accountable to? Who do they need to talk to make an agreement? You know, not long ago I got a new car, and as anybody who's purchased a car, new or used from a dealer at least, more often than not, they need an approval from a manager, or at least they tell you they need an approval from a manager. Now, I ended up with a great deal. I was very happy with it, and I ended up speaking with the sales manager along with the sales rep to save some time. We just all sat down and worked it all out in about a half an hour. What are their likely strategy and tactics? Now you have to use more educated guessing here and think, what could their strategy be? You'll probably be wrong, but it's okay. But if you know the person by reputation or their style, you might be able to guess more accurately what their strategy or strategies might be and their tactics. Be careful of reputation. Sometimes the reputation is accurate and sometimes it isn't. A lot of it is based on gossip, so be careful about that if you think you know someone. I always like to say, okay, yes, and let's see what happens. And if you're really well prepared, it won't matter. You'll be able to respond accordingly. And then finally, the protocol. And this can be simple stuff. When we do simulations, most of this protocol is determined for you. But in real life, you want to figure out, especially if it's a more complex negotiation, a lot of people are involved, what's the agenda going to be like at every negotiation meeting? Where are you going to meet? How much time are you going to take for each meeting? Not everyone wants to negotiate for 6 hours in one stretch. That's exhausting. So maybe you take regular breaks. A lot of the stuff actually has to be negotiated. Sometimes the preliminary meetings are simply how the negotiations are going to take place. So I'm just writing here that these are negotiated in large-scale negotiations. What happens if the negotiation fails? It doesn't mean that you're going to just go and work out things with your alternative, your BATNA. So if things get off track, how do you bring it back on track? Is there a mechanism in the negotiation to do that? How do you keep track of what's agreed to? For complex agreements, you need someone who's going to be tracking that. And how do we know if we have a good agreement? This is not just for yourself, but how do you know you have a good agreement with your opponent? One that's going to stick. Simple transactions, not much of a problem. But what happens if you buy something off someone and it breaks the next day? Is there a mechanism to cover that? Some online facilitators like eBay have mechanisms to protect buyers and sellers, at least to some degree. But a lot of times you might not have that. Or if it's a very involved and very detailed agreement, you want to make sure that the person doesn't renege, doesn't go back on the agreement later. And we can say, well, I'll just sue them or whatever. Yeah, but lawsuits take time, a lot of money, and it's really, really bad for relationships. So you don't want to go down that path where you have to take legal action to fulfill an agreement. That's terrible. And yet you might have to do it. What you want to be able to do is be as clear as possible that both parties or all parties involved in negotiation will fulfill the agreement over the long haul, or you may find yourself back at the negotiation table in spite of the fact that you have an agreement. So that's it for part one. In part two, we're going to take a closer look at strategy and tactics and how they fit into the plan.